Good evening. Arthur Hastings here, welcoming you once more to The Little Grey Cells. Tonight's tale: The Last Guest to Arrive, another Hercule Poirot mystery that will test the very limits of logic and reason. Before we begin, I must convey Poirot's own appreciation, and mine, to our extraordinary audience spanning continents and time zones. New listeners, we would be most honoured if you'd subscribe and share with us your location in the comments below. Tell us, if Miriam Ashworth had set a place for you at her table, what island in the world would you choose as your Trevorrow? Now then, settle into your chair, brew a proper tisane as the great detective would insist, and join me in unravelling this most curious affair. Your grey cells are about to be put to work. Chapter 1. The Cornish Water. In late October. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, and Hercule Poirot had read it 3 times before breakfast was cleared. It was not that the letter was unclear. Madame Miriam Ashworth wrote with the precision of a woman who had spent her life among words, and her invitation to Trevorrow Island for the reading of a codicil to her late husband's will was perfectly straightforward. What troubled Poirot, what caused him to set down his coffee cup with more than his usual care and tilt his head very slightly to the left, was the postscript. He had underlined it in pencil during his second reading. "I find I should very much like you here, my dear Poirot. You have always seen things clearly. I have need of someone who sees clearly." One did not summon Hercule Poirot to witness a routine legal formality. One summoned him when one expected that routine legal formalities might prove insufficient to contain what was about to emerge. He had accepted naturally. Curiosity was a professional virtue after all, and Miriam Ashworth was the particular kind of acquaintance whose intelligence commanded respect. They had met once, at a dinner party in 1932, discovered a mutual appreciation for Debussy and a shared intolerance of intellectual fraud, and had exchanged cordial letters at Christmas ever since. Not intimacy, precisely. Something more useful: recognition. Now, standing at the bow of the hired boat as it cut through the grey October water toward Trevorrow Island, Poirot removed the letter from his breast pocket and read it again. The handwriting did not change, of course. The postscript remained troubling. The water around the boat was the colour of old pewter. The horizon was blurred, as though the world beyond the island could not quite be trusted to remain in focus. It was not dramatic weather. That was perhaps the point. The Cornish sea in late October did not howl. It merely insisted with a kind of patient inevitability that was more unnerving than storms. The boatmen had not spoken since they left Porthcawl, except to ask whether Poirot was steady on his feet. Poirot had replied that he was steady everywhere that mattered. The boatman had not smiled. After 20 minutes, the island resolved itself from the general greyness of sea and sky. Trevorrow Island was not large. From this distance it appeared as a dark smudge of rock and vegetation rising from the water, dominated by a house of grey Georgian stone standing on the south-facing rise. 3 stories, good proportions, the windows reflecting what little light the afternoon offered. It had the quality of a face that had learned not to show what it was thinking. The boat slowed as they approached the dock. A man was waiting at the top of the path, standing with his hands loose at his sides, watching their approach without moving. Tall, lean, weathered, 60 perhaps, or older. The island's caretaker, one presumed. Poirot stepped onto the dock with care. The wood was slick with salt and recent rain. The man came down the path. He did not hurry, but neither did he waste motion. When he reached the dock, he nodded once and took Poirot's valise without asking permission. Poirot said, with the particular courtesy he reserved for those who did not appear to require it, "You are Monsieur Trevorrow, I think. James Trevorrow." The man nodded again. His face was difficult to read. Not unfriendly, precisely. Guarded. He had the eyes of a man who had spent his life watching weather and had learned to see patterns in things others dismissed as random. "House is ready," Trevorrow said. His voice was Cornish, flattened by decades of salt wind. "Fires lit. Mrs. Ashworth's in the drawing room with the others." He turned and began walking up the path. After 3 steps, he paused. He seemed to be about to say something. His mouth tightened slightly. Then he did not say it and continued walking. Poirot followed. He filed the pause under things of interest. A man who began to speak and then decided not to was a man who knew something he had not yet decided whether to share. The path rose steeply through scrub vegetation and exposed granite. To the left, the sea continued its patient insistence against the rocks. To the right, the land climbed toward the house, which grew larger with each step. The gardens, such as they were, showed signs of careful maintenance, but little ornament. Functional. Austere. The house itself seemed to lean slightly toward the sea, as though it had stood there so long it had begun to mirror the island's natural inclination. As they reached the final rise, the house came fully into view. The front door was painted a dark green that had weathered to something closer to black. The windows were tall and evenly spaced, 9 across the front, 3 stories high. Smoke rose from one chimney at the west end. The curtains in the drawing-room windows were drawn back, and Poirot could see, very faintly, the shapes of people moving inside. Trevorrow set down the valise at the door and reached for the handle. Then he stopped. He looked at Poirot directly for the first time since the dock. "They've been here 2 days," he said. "Since Saturday." Poirot inclined his head. "And how have they found the island, these guests of Madame Ashworth?" Trevorrow's mouth moved in what might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "They've been very polite," he said. It was the way he said polite that was interesting, as though politeness were a choice, consciously maintained, as though what lay beneath it required effort to conceal. "I see," said Poirot, who did not see, but would. Trevorrow opened the door. The hall inside was dim and smelled of beeswax and salt, and something else underneath, something faintly mineral, like a room that had been closed for too long. The floor was black and white marble, checkerboard pattern, slightly uneven with age. A staircase rose to the left. To the right, a door stood ajar, and from behind it came the murmur of voices. "Drawing room," Trevorrow said, nodding toward the door. "They're expecting you." He carried the valise toward the stairs and disappeared into the dimness of the upper hall without another word. Poirot stood in the centre of the checkerboard floor and adjusted his hat. He smoothed the lapels of his coat. He allowed himself a moment to observe what a house revealed when one first entered it. The paintings on the walls were maritime scenes, ships in storms mostly, dark water under darker skies. Picturesque catastrophe, someone had once called such things. The carpets visible through the open doors were the deep red of old Turkish weave, the colour of dried blood. From the drawing-room, a woman's voice said something Poirot could not distinguish, and another voice laughed. It was a polite laugh, carefully modulated. It was the laugh of someone who was being very careful. Poirot removed his hat and approached the drawing-room door. Before he entered, he paused. He had learned over many years that the first moment one observed a room full of people was often the most truthful. People arranged themselves in relation to one another with an honesty they did not extend to their words. The geometry of a room, Poirot had discovered, was more reliable than alibis. He stepped into the doorway and observed. The drawing-room was large, with windows facing south toward the grey line of the sea. A fire burned in the grate, but did not quite warm the space. There was a draught from somewhere. The furniture was good, Chesterfields upholstered in faded green velvet, wing-back chairs, a mahogany side table with a drinks tray. The paintings here were also maritime, also storms. The light was failing outside and the lamps had been lit, but they cast more shadows than illumination. 5 people occupied the room, not together, arranged. By the window, standing with his arms loosely folded, was a man of perhaps 43, handsome in the way of men who had been beautiful as boys, and knew it. He was watching the door when Poirot entered. To and his face performed a complex sequence. Relief, followed by the concealment of relief, followed by the appropriate expression of welcome. He came forward with his hand extended. "Monsieur Poirot, what a pleasure, Edmund Ashworth." His handshake was firm, his smile warm and tired in equal measure. He wore a good suit that had been worn often. There was a small stain on his cuff that he had tried to remove. The effort showed. On the Chesterfield nearest the fire sat a woman of perhaps 31, quietly pretty in a way she seemed to downplay deliberately. Plain dress, brown hair pulled back, a habit of looking slightly to the left of whoever spoke to her. She held a book in her lap, but Poirot noticed immediately that the page had not turned in some time. When Edmund moved from the window, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Near the drinks tray stood a man of late middle age, solid and prosperous-looking, with the face of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news calmly. He held a whiskey glass he had been holding, by the look of it, for quite some time. He nodded at Poirot, but did not approach. Sitting apart from the others nearest the door, positioned as though ready for departure at any moment, was a thin man of perhaps 56, with careful hands, and the habit of listening that was not engagement, but calculation. He had a briefcase at his feet that he touched occasionally, as though reassuring himself of its presence. And in the centre of the room, rising from a chair by the fire with a smile that was both genuine and weary, was Miriam Ashworth. She was 71 and looked it without apology. Her hair was silver, the cut short in a style that suggested practicality rather than vanity. She wore a dark grey dress of good wool, and no jewellery except a single ring on her right hand. Her face was lined, but her eyes were clear. They met Poirot's with the kind of recognition that exists between people who have agreed, at some point, not to be fooled. "My dear Poirot," she said, "you came." He crossed to her and took her hand. "But of course, madame. Did you doubt it?" "I doubted everything," she said quietly. Then, louder, addressing the room, "May I introduce Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who has been kind enough to join us for the reading of the codicil. Monsieur Poirot, you have met my stepson Edmund. This is Cecily Martin, my companion and secretary. Dr. Roland Vane, our family physician, and Mr. Lawrence Gould, I the solicitor." Poirot bowed slightly to each in turn. The woman, Cecily, inclined her head, but did not speak. Dr. Vane raised his glass in a gesture that might have been greeting or farewell. The solicitor Gould said in a voice like dry paper, "A pleasure, Monsieur Poirot." Miriam gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. Tea has just been brought. Or would you prefer something stronger?" "Tea would be most agreeable, madame." As he sat, Poirot allowed his gaze to travel once more around the room, cataloguing. Edmund had returned to his position by the window, but now stood differently. Weight shifted, as though relieved of some burden. The woman Cecily had not looked up from her book. Dr. Vane was staring into his whiskey with the expression of a man reading omens in dregs. The solicitor had placed one hand on his briefcase and left it there. Miriam poured tea with steady hands. She passed the cup to Poirot, and their eyes met briefly. In hers he saw what he had suspected since the postscript. Not fear, precisely. Something quieter. The expression of someone who has carried a weight for a very long time and has decided, at last, to set it down. "The crossing was tolerable, I trust," she said. "The water was grey," Poirot replied. "But patient." "Yes," said Miriam, "the island has a great deal of patience." There was a silence. It was not comfortable. Edmund cleared his throat. "We've been discussing the weather," he said with manufactured cheer. "Fascinating topic." "Indeed," said the solicitor dryly. "We have exhausted it." Cecily turned a page of her book. She had not read a word of it. Poirot was certain. Miriam set down her cup. "The codicil will be read tomorrow evening, after dinner. I thought it best to allow everyone a day to settle. The island can be disorienting when one first arrives." "Most considerate, madame," said Poirot. "I try," she said. Then, after a pause, "There will be 9 of us at dinner tonight. I've asked 2 additional guests to join us. They should arrive within the hour." Something changed in the room. Poirot could not identify what precisely. A shift in temperature, perhaps, or in attention. 9, said Edmund carefully. "I wasn't aware." "No," said Miriam, "you weren't." She rose from her chair. "Monsieur Poirot, if you would care to see your room before dinner, Cecily will show you. We dine at 8. I must speak with Mrs. Pascoe about the arrangements." She left the room before anyone could respond. Her footsteps receded down the hall. The silence she left behind was different from the silence that had preceded her departure. It had weight. Cecily rose and set her unread book on the table. "This way, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. Poirot followed her into the hall. Behind him he heard Edmund say, very softly, 9, and Dr. Vane, even more softly, "God help us." Chapter 2. The Room That Knew Too Much. Cecily led him up the staircase without speaking. She moved quickly as though conscious of the silence behind them in the drawing room, as though distance from that silence was a practical necessity. The staircase was wide, the banister dark wood, polished to a sheen that caught what little light filtered through the landing window. And the carpets here were the same Turkish red as below, worn to grey in the centre where generations of feet had climbed. At the first landing, a portrait hung in shadow. A man in late middle age, heavy-jowled, with eyes that seemed to follow movement. Poirot paused briefly before it. "Sir Geoffrey," Cecily said without being asked. Her voice was careful, painted 2 years before his death. He was a substantial man. He was. She did not elaborate. They climbed to the second floor. The corridor stretched in both directions, doors evenly spaced, all closed. The wallpaper was faded green damask, and there was the same draught Poirot had noticed below, as though the house breathed through, invisible gaps. Cecily stopped at the third door on the right and opened it. "This was prepared for you yesterday. If you require anything, you need only ring. Mrs. Pascoe manages the house, but I attend to the guests." Poirot entered. The room was of moderate size, with a single window overlooking the sea. A bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, a chair. The furniture was good but impersonal, like a hotel room in a house that had forgotten how to be a home. His valise sat at the foot of the bed where Trevorrow had left it. "The bathroom is across the hall," Cecily continued. "Dinner is at 8. We dress." She hesitated in the doorway. For a moment Poirot thought she might speak further. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite identify. Not curiosity. Something more specific. Measurement, perhaps. "You are a friend of Mrs. Ashworth," she said at last. "An acquaintance, mademoiselle. Of some years' standing, but not intimate." "Then you don't know her well?" It was not quite a question. Poirot tilted his head. "I know her sufficiently to be intrigued by her invitation." Cecily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said. "The invitation." She stepped back into the corridor. "Dinner at 8, Monsieur Poirot." She was gone before he could reply. Poirot closed the door and stood in the centre of the room, listening. The house made small sounds, the creak of wood settling, the distant murmur of voices from below, the persistent presence of the sea beyond the window. He unpacked methodically, hanging his suits with precision, arranging his toiletries in exact alignment on the dresser. Order imposed upon disorder was not merely habit. It was a form of control when control was otherwise absent. When he had finished, off he sat at the writing desk and withdrew Miriam's letter from his pocket. He read the postscript again. "I have need of someone who sees clearly." What was there to see? A house on an island. 7 guests, soon to be 9. A will, or rather a codicil to a will, to be read tomorrow evening. Tensions beneath polite surfaces. The caretaker who almost spoke but did not. The companion who looked to the left of speakers. The doctor who stared into whiskey like a man reading his own diagnosis. And the 9th place setting, if Miriam intended to keep her word. Poirot rose and crossed to the window. The sea was darker now, the afternoon fading into the grey uniformity that seemed native to this latitude. Far across the water, the lights of Porthcawl were beginning to appear, small and distant. Between here and there, nothing, just water, patient and grey. He thought of islands and of the particular quality of places one could not easily leave. A bell rang somewhere below. 6 o'clock. 2 hours until dinner. When Poirot descended at 7:45, dressed in his evening clothes with his moustache waxed to perfection, the house had transformed. Lamps burned in sconces along the corridor, and through the drawing-room door he could hear voices raised slightly above the conversational minimum. Not argument. Performance. He paused at the threshold. The room had rearranged itself since the afternoon. Edmund stood by the fire now, gesturing with a glass in his hand, speaking to a woman Poirot had not seen before. She sat in the wing-back chair that had been empty earlier, her posture suggesting that sitting was a concession rather than a preference. And she was perhaps 64, dressed in dark blue silk, and she held a cigarette in a holder with the ease of someone who had been photographed doing so many times. Dr. Vane had moved to the sofa where he sat beside another newcomer, a man of perhaps 50, lean and weathered in a way different from Trevorrow. sunburned rather than windburned. He wore his evening dress as though it were mildly uncomfortable, and he listened to Vane without visible interest. Cecily stood by the window where Edmund had stood earlier, holding a sherry she had not drunk. She was watching the woman in the wing-back chair with an expression Poirot filed under careful study. The solicitor, Gould, maintained his position by the door, briefcase still at his feet. Miriam entered from the opposite side of the room and saw Poirot immediately, as she crossed to him with her hands extended. "My dear Poirot, you are prompt. Allow me to complete the introductions." She gestured toward the woman in the wing-back chair. "Mrs. Vivian Crail, my oldest friend. We were at school together a century ago." Vivian Crail rose with fluid grace and extended her hand. Her fingers were cool, her grip firmer than her apparent delicacy suggested. "Monsieur Poirot, Miriam has spoken of you often." "You are too kind, madame." "I am rarely kind," she said and smiled. "But I'm often accurate." Her eyes were pale grey, remarkably clear. They met Poirot's with the directness of someone who had learned long ago that looking away betrayed more than looking did. Miriam continued to the man on the sofa. "And this is Captain Henry Wardlaw, retired. Henry served with Geoffrey in the war. They remained close." Wardlaw stood and shook Poirot's hand briefly. "Not as close as all that. Geoffrey and I wrote occasionally. Miriam was kind enough to include me in the gathering." His voice carried the clipped precision of military habit, softened slightly by what might have been embarrassment. "You are most welcome," said Miriam, though her tone suggested the welcome was a complicated thing. Poirot observed, as he had in the afternoon, the geometry. Vivian had positioned herself at the centre of visual attention. Edmund orbited at a distance that could be attentive or wary. Dr. Vane sat as far from Vivian as the room allowed. Wardlaw seemed uncertain where to position himself and had settled for proximity to the doctor as the least complicated option. And Cecily remained at the periphery, watching everything. "We are 8, then," Poirot said mildly. "Not quite," said Miriam. "We are still expecting one guest. They sent word they would arrive before dinner, but—" She glanced at the clock on the mantel. Punctuality has never been their particular virtue. Vivian laughed, a sound like crystal meeting silver. "You cannot expect everyone to match your standards, darling. Some of us are content with approximation." "Some of us," said Miriam quietly, "mistake approximation for grace." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Vivian's smile did not waver, but something behind it hardened. Edmund cleared his throat. "Shall we move to the dining room? I'm famished." "We shall wait," Miriam said. 10 more minutes." They waited. The conversation resumed in fits and starts. Or Vivian told an anecdote about the train from London, a mishap with luggage that she rendered amusing through sheer force of delivery. Wardlaw contributed a brief observation about the crossing from Porthcawl. Gould said nothing. Dr. Vane finished his whisky and did not refill it. At precisely 7 minutes past 8, the front door opened. Poirot heard it clearly from the drawing room. The heavy scrape of wood against stone, the admission of wind and salt air, the subsequent closure. Footsteps crossed the hall, not hurried, measured. James Trevorrow appeared in the doorway. He nodded once to Miriam. "Your last guest, ma'am." He stepped aside and a woman entered. She was perhaps 35, tall, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was handsome rather than beautiful. She wore travelling clothes that were well made but showed the marks of a long journey. She carried a small leather case and had the bearing of someone who expected obstacles and had learned to navigate them without complaint. Miriam crossed the room. "Miss Grey, I had begun to worry. The train was delayed at Exeter. I apologise." Her voice was low, unaccented, precise. "I came as quickly as I could." "Of course." Miriam turned to the others. "May I present Miss Diana Gray? Miss Gray is a journalist. She has been researching a series of articles on estate law and the complications of inheritance in modern families. I thought her presence might provide valuable perspective." Miss Gray nodded to the room generally. Her gaze swept across the assembled company with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to cataloguing details quickly. Edmund stepped forward. "A journalist? How fascinating. Which paper?" "I am freelance at present," Miss Gray replied, "though I have published in the Observer and the Telegraph." "And you are writing about inheritance?" Vivian's tone was pleasant, but her eyes had narrowed slightly. "Among other subjects. Mrs. Ashworth was kind enough to agree to an interview regarding the Ashworth estate and its administration. It seemed an opportune time." "Indeed," said Gould softly. It was the first word he had spoken since Poirot's arrival. Poirot observed this ninth guest with particular attention. She stood at the edge of the group, not quite joining it, or maintaining the distance appropriate to someone whose presence was professional rather than personal. But there was something else, a quality of watchfulness that exceeded journalistic interest. She looked at Miriam with an expression that was not merely curiosity, it was recognition. "Well," said Miriam, and her voice was bright, brittle. "Now we are 9. Shall we go in?" The dining room was lit by candles, dozens of them in silver candelabra down the centre of the long table. The curtains were drawn against the dark outside, and the room had the enclosed quality of a stage set. The table was laid with precision. China that bore a crest Poirot did not recognise, crystal that caught and scattered the candlelight, silver that gleamed. 9 place settings. Poirot counted them as he entered. He counted them again as he took his seat, which was midway down the table on Miriam's right. Edmund sat at the far end, opposite Miriam. Vivienne was to Miriam's left, then Dr. Vane, then Cecily. On Poirot's right sat Miss Grey, then Wardlaw, then Gould. The 9th setting was at the far end beside Edmund, empty. The chair was pulled back slightly, as though someone had just left it. The napkin was folded, the wineglass empty but present. No one mentioned it. Miriam lifted her glass. "Two absent friends," she said. The others lifted their glasses and murmured agreement. The words hung in the air like smoke. Poirot drank and said nothing. He watched. The meal proceeded with the uneasy rhythm of a gathering that was performing normalcy rather than achieving it. Edmund launched into an anecdote about a shooting party in Scotland, his charm deployed at maximum wattage. Vivian countered with a story about the theatre, a disastrous Ibsen production she had attended in the spring. Wardlaw spoke briefly, reluctantly, about service in India. Miss Grey asked occasional questions with the careful precision of someone conducting an interview without appearing to do so. Dr. Vane ate mechanically and contributed nothing. Cecily served more than she ate, attending to dishes and wine with the efficiency of long practice. And throughout, the empty chair remained, present in its absence. The 9th setting untouched. Poirot found himself looking at it repeatedly. Who was expected? Who was being remembered? And why had Miriam arranged this particular tableau? It was during the main course, lamb with mint sauce, that Cecily made her small error. Edmund was describing something Geoffrey had mentioned about the Trevorrow property, a detail about shooting leases. He placed it in 1933. That would have been 1930, Cecily said quietly, not looking up from her plate. Sir Geoffrey sold the Trevorrow shooting lease in 1930. The silence was absolute. Edmund's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. His smile assembled itself with visible effort. Of course, you're quite right, Miss Martin. I stand corrected. You have a remarkable memory for dates, Vivian observed. Her tone was pleasant. The words were not. Cecily's jaw tightened. Mrs. Ashworth's filing system is very thorough. I've had occasion to consult it often. Naturally, said Vivian. She sipped her wine and said nothing further, but her gaze remained on Cecily with the attention of a collector examining a specimen. Miriam cut her lamb and changed the subject with practiced ease. The conversation resumed, fractured and forced. Poirot ate and watched and catalogued. The quality of silence when Cecily spoke. The way Edmund's hand tightened on his glass. The manner in which Vivian observed everything from behind her mask of sophisticated disinterest. The fact that Miss Grey had produced a small notebook and was making brief notes, which she did not attempt to conceal, and the empty chair, which no one looked at directly, but which everyone knew was there. After dinner, they returned to the drawing room for coffee. Poirot positioned himself near the fire, where he could observe without seeming to do so. Vivienne played the piano on something melancholy in a minor key. Edmund and Wardlaw spoke of inconsequential matters with the determination of men avoiding consequential ones. Gould sat with his briefcase and radiated patient disapproval. Miss Grey approached Poirot. Monsieur Poirot, Mrs. Ashworth mentioned you are a detective. I have been, mademoiselle. I am retired, but not inactive, I think. One observes. It is a difficult habit to break. And what have you observed this evening? He smiled. That you are not merely a journalist, mademoiselle, or rather, that you are a journalist with a particular interest that exceeds professional curiosity. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes acknowledged the hit. I am thorough in my research. Mais oui, but thoroughness explains presence. It does not explain the manner in which you looked at Madame Ashworth when you entered. And how was that? As though you knew her already, or knew of her. Miss Grey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, I knew Sir Geoffrey, briefly, a long time ago. Before Poirot could respond, Miriam appeared at his elbow. Miss Grey, would you care for brandy? Monsieur Poirot. They accepted. Miriam poured with steady hands. When she passed Poirot his glass, their eyes met. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. But of course, madame, though I confess I do not yet understand entirely why I am here. Her smile was sad. You will, my dear Poirot. All too soon you will. She moved away to attend to other guests. Poirot sipped his brandy and watched the room. 9 people now, each carrying their separate weights, each performing their separate roles. And somewhere, beneath the performance, something waited, something patient and grey, like the sea outside. At 11:30, the company began to disperse. Edmund was first, pleading fatigue from the journey, then Wardlaw, then Gould. Vivian remained at the piano, playing quietly. Cecily collected coffee cups with silent efficiency. Miss Grey stood by the window, looking out at darkness. Poirot climbed the stairs to his room. The house creaked around him. From below, the piano continued, faint and melancholy. He prepared for bed with his usual meticulousness. He lay in the dark and listened. Footsteps in the corridor, a door opening, closing, silence. Then, much later, another door. Someone descending the stairs. A drawer opening somewhere below, in the study perhaps. Papers rustling, and the drawer closing. Footsteps returning. A different gate. Someone else moving through the house in the hours when movement should have ceased. Poirot lay very still and listened to the architecture of secrets. He thought of the 9th place setting. The empty chair. The invitation extended to someone who had not come, or could not come, or was already here in ways the others did not yet understand. He thought, Madame Ashworth has arranged this gathering with care. Every person at that table was chosen. Every placement considered, including the empty one. He did not sleep for a long time. Chapter 3. The morning of the second day. Poirot woke at 7 with the precision of a man whose internal clock acknowledged no holiday from routine. The room was grey with dawn light filtered through rain. He could hear it against the window, steady and insistent. The sea beyond was invisible, erased by weather. He rose and performed his morning ablutions with meticulous care. The face that emerged from his shaving ritual was, as always, impeccable. The moustache required particular attention this morning. One must maintain standards, especially when standards were all one could maintain. He descended to breakfast at 7:30. The dining room was empty. This was unusual for a house party, even one as strained as this. By 8 o'clock, there should have been movement, the particular architecture of a household organising itself for the day. There was only silence. Poirot poured coffee from the sideboard and sat at his place from the previous evening. The table had been cleared, reset for breakfast, but the 9th setting was still there. Empty plate, empty cup, the napkin folded with care. He was drinking his second cup when he heard the scream. It was not dramatic. That was what made it terrible, just a single sharp intake of breath from somewhere above, followed by a sound that might have been a word or might have been nothing at all. Poirot set down his cup and moved quickly toward the stairs. He met Dr. Vane in the hall. The doctor was already dressed, his medical bag in hand, moving with the swift purposefulness of a man who had been summoned to crisis many times before. They reached the staircase together and climbed. The door to Miriam's room stood open. Cecily was in the doorway, her face the colour of old paper, one hand pressed against the frame as though holding herself upright. "She won't wake," Cecily said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I brought her tea. She won't wake." "Doctor." Vane moved past her into the room. Poirot followed, noting as he entered that Cecily did not move from the doorway, did not turn to watch, simply stood with her hand against the wood and stared at nothing. The bedroom was large, dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with green damask. Miriam lay in the centre of it, covers drawn to her chest, hands folded neatly at her sides. Her eyes were closed. She might have been sleeping except for the absolute stillness of her face, which had the waxen quality of something that had ceased being human and become instead an arrangement of features. Dr. Vane bent over her, felt for a pulse at her throat, her wrist. He lifted one eyelid, then the other. He performed these actions with mechanical precision, though the verdict was already written in the set of his shoulders. Yet on the nightstand beside the bed sat a bottle of sleeping tablets. Poirot crossed to it and read the label without touching. 20 tablets prescribed, 12 remaining. An empty water glass stood beside the bottle. There was a faint residue at the bottom, barely visible. No note. Poirot scanned the room carefully. No paper, no letter, nothing that suggested final words. Dr. Vane straightened. He looked at Poirot with the expression of a man delivering a diagnosis he had delivered too many times to count, but would never grow accustomed to delivering. "She's gone," he said. His voice was steady. "Several hours, I should think. Some time in the night." "The tablets?" Poirot asked quietly. Vane glanced at the bottle. 8 are missing. More than enough." He paused. "The door was unlocked when Miss Martin entered?" "From the doorway," Aunt Cecily said, "yes. She always locks it. Always." "Perhaps last night she forgot," Vane said. But he said it as though he did not believe it. Poirot moved to the door that connected to the adjacent sitting room. It was closed, but not locked. He opened it carefully. The sitting room beyond was small, furnished with a writing desk and a chair. A suitcase sat on a luggage stand. Women's clothing hung in the wardrobe, visible through the partially open door. "This room?" he asked. "Mrs. Crale's," said Cecily. "Mrs. Ashworth assigned it to her when the guests arrived." Poirot examined the connecting door from the sitting room side. No bolt, no key. It could be locked only from Miriam's bedroom. He returned to Miriam's room and stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the arranged stillness of the scene. The folded hands, yet the smoothed covers, the precise placement of the bottle. "She composed herself before she died," Dr. Vane observed. "That is not unusual in cases of deliberate overdose. A kind of final order." "Oui," said Poirot softly. Order was important to her. By this time, footsteps were coming up the stairs. Edmund arrived first, still in his dressing gown, his hair uncombed. Behind him came Gould, fully dressed as though he had not slept at all, and then Vivian Crale, wrapped in a silk robe of dark blue, her face pale but composed. Edmund stopped in the doorway. "Miriam?" "I'm very sorry," Dr. Vane said. "She's passed." Edmund pushed past Cecily into the room. He looked at the bed, at the bottle, at the empty glass. His face performed several rapid transformations. Shock, confusion, grief, and something else beneath these that Poirot could not immediately identify. Calculation, perhaps, or fear. "No," Edmund said. "No, she wouldn't. She was perfectly well yesterday. She was planning the reading. She wouldn't." "Nevertheless," said Vane. Vivian remained in the doorway beside Cecily. She looked at the bed for a long moment, then turned away. Her hand went to her mouth. When she lowered it, her expression was perfectly calibrated grief. "Poor Miriam," she said quietly. "Poor dear Miriam." Gould stood at the threshold, briefcase in hand as always. He said nothing. His gaze moved from the bed to the bottle to the connecting door, which still stood open, and back to the bed. "The authorities must be notified," he said at last. "The boat won't cross in this weather," Cecily replied. Her voice was still that terrible, flat calm. "James checked the radio at 6. The boatman says 2 days minimum, possibly 3. Edmund turned sharply. 3 days? We're trapped here with—" He stopped. "With what, Mr. Ashworth?" Poirot asked mildly. Edmund's jaw worked. "With a death, with Miriam dead and no way to notify anyone." "Mrs. Ashworth has taken her own life," Dr. Vane said firmly. "Tragic, but not uncommon in cases of prolonged grief or depression." I saw no signs, but one does not always see the signs. You are certain it was suicide? Poirot asked. Vane's face hardened. What else would it be? Poirot did not answer. He moved to the nightstand and bent close to the water glass without touching it. There was that residue, yes, but also something else. A faint smell, bitter, medicinal. He straightened. The room should be left undisturbed until the authorities can reach us. Are you suggesting... Edmund began. I am suggesting nothing, monsieur. I am stating what is prudent. The others filed out slowly. Edmund last, looking back at the bed with an expression Poirot filed under complex grief. Cecily closed the door and stood with her back to it, as though guarding it. I should sit with her, Vivian said. She was my oldest friend. I should... The room is to remain closed, Poirot said gently but firmly. Dr. Vane, you agree this is wise? Vane nodded slowly. Yes, until proper arrangements can be made. They descended to the drawing room. The house felt different now, compressed by weather outside and catastrophe within. Someone had lit the fire, but it gave no warmth. Poirot accepted coffee from the tray Cecily brought, and the others gathered in their separate territories. Edmund by the window, staring out at the rain. Vivienne on the sofa, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. Gould in his chair by the door, briefcase between his feet like a faithful dog. Wardlaw and Miss Grey appeared at 9:30, having been woken by the commotion. They received the news with varying degrees of shock. Wardlaw looked genuinely stricken. Miss Grey's expression was harder to read. She produced her notebook, then seemed to think better of it and put it away. Poor Mrs. Ashworth, she said. I had hoped to speak with her further this morning. What about? Edmund asked sharply. The estate, the interview. That was why I was invited. Yes, said Edmund. Why were you invited? Before Miss Grey could answer, Vivian said quietly, Edmund, not now. Why not now? Miriam is dead. Miriam has... He stopped, breathing heavily. I'm sorry. Forgive me. This is a shock. For all of us, said Vivian. She looked at Edmund with something in her eyes that was not quite sympathy. We must all be very careful not to say things we cannot take back. The room settled into uneasy silence. Outside, the rain continued. At 11 o'clock, Poirot asked Cecily if he might see Miriam's study. Why? She asked. I should like to understand how Madame Ashworth spent her final evening. Dr. Vane tells me that sometimes, when one is contemplating such an act, there are signs. Perhaps she left something that will help us understand. Cecily studied him for a moment, then she nodded. This way. The study was on the ground floor, at the rear of the house overlooking the gardens. Or it was a woman's room, smaller than a man's study would have been, brighter, arranged with care. A desk faced the window. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. A fire had been laid, but not lit. The desk lamp was still on. Poirot noted this immediately. The bulb cast a pool of yellow light onto the desktop, where papers lay scattered. A pen, uncapped, had rolled against a leather blotter, and beside the blotter, a book lay open. Poirot crossed to it. The volume was old, leather-bound. He read the spine. The Complete Poems of John Donne. The book was open to a page that had been marked by a corner fold. This alone was interesting. Poirot had observed Miriam's books yesterday in the drawing room. She used silk bookmarks, never folded pages. On the open page, 2 words had been underlined in pencil. Either pressure hard enough to indent the paper slightly, mighty and dreadful. The full lines read, "Death be not proud, though some have called thee / mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so." Poirot stood very still. He read the passage again. Then he lifted the book carefully and saw what lay beneath it. A calling card. Old-fashioned, cream-coloured, printed with 2 initials in elegant script. V.C. Vivienne Crail. Cecily, standing in the doorway, drew a sharp breath. Poirot set the book down. He looked at the card without touching it. "This was here when you entered this morning." "I didn't enter this morning. I haven't been in the study since yesterday afternoon." "And yesterday afternoon, was it here?" "I don't know. I didn't notice." Her voice was tight. "What does it mean?" "That, mademoiselle, is a most excellent question." He turned back to the desk. The papers were covered in Miriam's handwriting. Notes about household accounts, correspondence regarding estate matters. Nothing unusual. But when he lifted the blotter, a corner of folded paper caught his eye. He extracted it carefully. 2 pages covered in Miriam's precise hand, addressed to him. "My dear Poirot, if you are reading this, I am dead. I had hoped it would not come to this, but I have taken certain precautions. What I have learned cannot be allowed to—" The letter ended mid-sentence, unfinished. Poirot looked up at Cecily. She had gone very pale. "You knew this was here," he said gently. "I found it 10 minutes ago, before you came down. I came to see if she had been working last night." Her hands twisted together. "I read it. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, but I did." "And?" "It says things. About all of us. About what she knew." "What did she know, Miss Martin?" Cecily was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and withdrew the pages she had taken. She handed them to Poirot. He read them standing at Miriam's desk, with the rain falling outside and the lamp still burning, and his face revealed nothing. When he had finished, he folded the pages carefully and placed them in his own pocket. "You are Sir Geoffrey's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. And Madame Ashworth knew this." "She knew everything, Monsieur Poirot. That was her particular gift." Cecily's voice broke slightly. "She knew everything, and she was trying to set it right. And now she's dead." "Or perhaps," said Poirot quietly, "because she knew everything." He looked again at the calling card on the desk. V.C. Vivienne Crail, who had known Miriam since they were 14. Vivienne Crail, who had a room connected to Miriam's by an unlocked door. Vivienne Crail, who had been Geoffrey's first love. "Tell me, Miss Martin, when you brought the tea this morning, did you see or hear anything unusual? Footsteps in the night, perhaps?" Cecily hesitated. The lie that Edmund had witnessed earlier at 11:30 was preparing itself. Poirot could see it forming. Then she said very quietly, "Yes, at 1:30. I heard footsteps in the corridor. I thought it was Mrs. Ashworth going to the bathroom, but now you think perhaps it was not." "I don't know what to think any more." Poirot turned back to the desk. The book, the card, the unfinished letter, the underlined words, mighty and dreadful. Death be not proud. He thought of the 9th place setting, the empty chair, the invitation extended to someone who had not arrived. Or perhaps he thought now, to someone who had arrived after all. Someone who was here in this house, who had always been here, who had been patient and grey like the October sea, and was now no longer patient. He looked at Cecily. "I will need your absolute honesty from this point forward, mademoiselle. Can you give me that?" She met his eyes. "I can try." "That will suffice." He gestured to the door. "We should return to the others. And Miss Martin, say nothing of the letter. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because," said Poirot, "I wish to observe who asks about it, and who does not." They left the study. Behind them the lamp continued to burn. And the rain continued to fall, and on the desk Vivian Crail's calling card lay beside the book of poems, like an accusation waiting to be voiced. But accusations, Poirot knew, were not always what they appeared to be. Sometimes they were invitations, sometimes they were traps, and sometimes, most dangerously of all, they were both. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Secrets. The morning proceeded with the peculiar rhythm of a household in which something fundamental has fractured. People moved through rooms with purpose, but no destination. Conversations began and ended without resolution. Edmund paced the drawing room like a man measuring a cage. Vivian sat by the window, looking at the rain with an expression that suggested she was seeing something other than weather. At 10:30, while Dr. Devane and Edmund conducted what appeared to be a conference in the study, Poirot descended to the kitchen. Mrs. Pascoe, the cook, was a village woman of substantial build and sensible demeanour, who had been crossing to the island 3 days a week for the past 7 years. She looked up from the pastry she was rolling when Poirot entered, and her expression suggested that Belgian detectives in her kitchen were not among the complications she had anticipated when accepting this position. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, dusting flour from her hands, "can I help you?" "Madame, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I have, I fear, certain particular requirements regarding breakfast. The boiled egg, for instance, must be prepared with precision, 4 minutes exactly. Not 3.5, not 4.25. 4 minutes. Mrs. Pascoe regarded him with the expression of someone reassessing her understanding of the world. 4 minutes. Exactement. And the toast, it must be of an even colour, not burned at the edges, you comprehend. A uniform golden brown. I'll do my best, sir. You are most kind." He accepted the cup of tea she poured for him and settled himself at the kitchen table as though he had been taking tea in this kitchen for years. Mrs. Pascoe returned to her pastry with the wariness of someone who had not yet determined whether she was being consulted or invaded. After a suitable interval, Poirot said, "You have been with the household some time, I believe." 7 years come November. "Then you knew Sir Geoffrey?" Her hands paused briefly in their work. "I did. He was a good employer, fair." "And Madame Ashworth?" "A good woman. A kind woman." Her voice tightened. "It's a terrible thing that's happened." "Oui, most terrible." Poirot sipped his tea. "You come across from the village 3 times each week, is this correct?" "Monday, Wednesday, Friday, unless there's a party, then I come extra." "And the household routine? It is regular, predictable?" Mrs. Pascoe considered this. Mrs. Ashworth liked things done properly, meals at set times, the house kept just so. Miss Martin helped with that, of course. Very efficient, Miss Martin. "She has been with Madame Ashworth for 3 years, I understand." "About that, yes, came from London. Mrs. Ashworth said she needed a companion, someone to help with correspondence and such. Miss Martin was perfect for it, quiet, capable. Doesn't put herself forward." Poirot set down his cup and adjusted its position on the saucer by perhaps a 1/4 inch. "Tell me, madame, the sleeping arrangements for this particular gathering, they were made by Madame Ashworth herself?" "They were. She had me help move some things around the week before the guests arrived. Miss Martin was in that little sitting room next to Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom, usual-like. But Mrs. Ashworth said Miss Martin should be moved to the east wing, give her more space. The sitting room was made up for Mrs. Crail. The sitting room that connects to Madame Ashworth's bedroom. That's right. There's a door between. Mrs. Ashworth said Mrs. Crail would appreciate being close by. They were old friends. Poirot was very still. And this door, it locks on both sides? Only from Mrs. Ashworth's side. As I recall, the sitting room side has no bolt. I see, he paused. Was it Madame Ashworth's habit to lock her bedroom door at night? Mrs. Pascoe dried her hands on her apron. Always, she was particular about her privacy. Every night I'd hear the key turn when I passed by on my way to my own room. But this morning, the door was unlocked. So I heard. Mrs. Pascoe's voice dropped. Poor Miss Martin, finding her like that. The shock of it. Poirot rose from the table. You have been most helpful, madame, and I trust you will remember. 4 minutes for the egg. 4 minutes, she repeated, with the solemnity of someone accepting a sacred charge. Poirot found Cecily in the morning room, a small parlour at the rear of the house that overlooked the gardens. As she sat in a chair by the window with the novel she had been reading the previous evening, though Poirot observed that she had made no progress beyond the page on which she had been arrested yesterday. Miss Martin, may I join you? She looked up. Her face was pale, the shadows beneath her eyes suggesting a night without sleep. Of course. He settled himself in the opposite chair. Outside, the rain had intensified. The gardens were grey, the sea beyond them greyer still. You are reading, he observed, attempting to, but without success. The words seemed to have lost their meaning. She closed the book. I suppose that's to be expected. Grief does strange things to our capacity for concentration. He paused. Or perhaps it is not grief alone that troubles you. Cecily met his eyes. You're very direct. Monsieur Poirot, I have found that indirection wastes time we may not have. He gestured toward the window. We are marooned here for at least 2 more days, perhaps 3. In such circumstances, clarity becomes essential. Clarity about what? About what happened, about what is still happening. He leaned forward slightly. Miss Martin, when you first came to this house 3 years ago, what was the very first thing you noticed? The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for a moment, then said, the photographs on the mantelpiece, in the drawing room. There were 3 of them. One of Sir Geoffrey as a young man, very handsome, very sure of himself. One of Mrs. Ashworth's wedding to Sir Geoffrey, and one I didn't recognise. Describe it to me. A woman holding a child. The woman was perhaps 30. Well, the child was 7 or 8. They were standing in a garden somewhere. Not here. The light was different. Softer. And you asked Madame Ashworth about this photograph. I did. She said it was an old friend of the family. Then she took the photograph and moved it to the study. And later, in the study, you looked at it more closely. It was not a question. Cecily's expression confirmed what Poirot had already deduced. Yes, she said quietly. The child had Geoffrey Ashworth's eyes, exactly his eyes. The shape, the colour, even the expression. I would know those eyes anywhere. I'd been looking at his portrait every day. And you understood what this meant. I suspected. I couldn't be certain. It might have been coincidence or family resemblance of some kind. But I suspected. Poirot tilted his head. You knew even then? Cecily was silent. Then? I knew what I hoped was true. My mother died when I was 7. My father, the man I called my father, died when I was 12. I was raised by an aunt who loved me but never quite looked at me without a certain puzzlement, as though I didn't fit where I had been placed. When I saw that photograph, I thought— She stopped. I thought perhaps I knew why. And 2 years ago, Monsieur Gould confirmed your suspicion. He didn't mean to. He let something slip about the arrangements for my education, the trust that paid for it. I pressed him. He's not good at lying. She looked down at her hands. He told me the truth, that Sir Geoffrey was my father, that he had provided for me from a distance, that when the position here became available, he arranged for me to be considered. Though he didn't tell Mrs. Ashworth about the connection, he wanted me to have the opportunity to know my father's family, even if I couldn't acknowledge the relationship. And Madame Ashworth, when did she learn the truth? I don't know. She never said anything directly, but she knew. I'm certain she knew. The way she looked at me sometimes, the way she insisted I call her Miriam when we were alone. Not Mrs. Ashworth, just Miriam. As though we were— Her voice caught. As though we were family. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very gently, "Miss Martin, are you by any chance carrying a letter that was written by Madame Ashworth?" The silence that followed was absolute. Cecily's face went very still. Her hands tightened on the book in her lap. She began. Poirot raised a hand. "You need not answer now. But I must tell you that if such a letter exists, it may contain information essential to understanding what happened, and what is still happening." "What do you mean, what is still happening?" "I mean, mademoiselle, that Madame Ashworth did not take her own life. I am as certain of this as I have ever been certain of anything." Cecily stared at him. "But the tablets, the door—" "The tablets were administered, oui. The door was unlocked. But these things do not prove suicide. They prove only that someone wished us to believe in suicide." "Who?" "That," said Poirot, rising from his chair, "is what we must discover, and quickly, because whoever killed Madame Ashworth is still in this house. And they know that we are beginning to ask the right questions." He moved toward the door, then paused. "When you are ready, Miss Martin, I would very much like to see that letter." He left her sitting by the window, staring at the rain, her novel unopened in her lap. Poirot climbed the stairs to the first-floor landing. The house was quiet around him, filled with the particular silence of people avoiding one another. From somewhere below came the murmur of voices, Edmund and Dr. Vane, still conferring. From above, the creak of floorboards as someone moved in one of the upper rooms. He stopped at the landing and looked at the painting that hung there. It was a large oil, perhaps 4 feet by 3, depicting a ship in a storm. The vessel was tilted at a dangerous angle, sails torn, waves towering. The sky was the colour of old bruises. It was picturesque catastrophe rendered with technical skill. The kind of painting wealthy men bought to demonstrate that they understood drama without having to experience it directly. Poirot stood before it for several minutes, apparently lost in aesthetic contemplation. He noticed the dust. The frame was dark wood, elaborately carved. Most of it showed the even grey accumulation of months or years. But along the left edge, there was a strip perhaps an inch wide where the dust pattern was different. Lighter, as though something had recently disturbed it, as though the painting had been removed from the wall and replaced. Poirot glanced up and down the corridor. He was alone. He reached up and tested the right side of the frame, applying gentle pressure. It swung outward smoothly, silent on hidden hinges. Behind it, set into the wall, was a safe. It was a modern safe, steel, with a combination lock. The dial gleamed dully in the dim light of the landing. Poirot made no attempt to open it. He simply observed its presence, its size, its accessibility. Then he closed the painting carefully, ensuring it hung exactly as it had before. He stood there for a moment longer, thinking. A safe behind a painting depicting shipwreck. Miriam Ashworth, who had spent 5 years gathering evidence of something, evidence that needed to be kept secure, hidden, but retrievable. He thought of her letter to him, unfinished. What I have learned cannot be allowed to what? To remain hidden, to be destroyed, or perhaps cannot be allowed to die with her. Footsteps on the stairs below. Poirot moved away from the painting with unhurried grace, positioning himself at the window that overlooked the gardens as though he had been there all along, admiring the view. Vivian Crail appeared at the top of the stairs. She saw him and paused. Monsieur Poirot, admiring our Cornish weather? It has a certain insistence, madame. She came to stand beside him at the window. They looked out at the rain together. After a moment, she said, Miriam loved this house, even when it was impossible to love, even when everything else was falling apart. She loved this house. It is an interesting choice of verb, madame. Everything else falling apart. Vivienne turned to look at him. Her face was perfectly composed, but something in her eyes was not. We are all falling apart, Monsieur Poirot. Some of us simply do it more gracefully than others. She moved past him toward her room, her silk robe whispering against the carpet. Poirot remained at the window, watching the rain, thinking about safes and secrets and the particular way that Vivian Crail had not asked him why he was standing in the corridor looking at paintings. Because she already knew, perhaps, that the painting was not merely a painting, or because she had stood in this exact spot herself, not so long ago, asking herself the same questions. He descended the stairs slowly, his mind arranging facts like pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to reveal its shape. A safe behind a painting, a connecting door, unlocked, a bottle of tablets, a calling card left in a study, an unfinished letter, a photograph moved from mantelpiece to study. And beneath all of it, the patient grey insistence of the October sea, which held its secrets until someone thought to ask the right questions. Poirot reached the ground floor and paused in the checkerboard hall. From the drawing room came the sound of piano music, someone playing something melancholy in a minor key. He stood very still, listening. The music stopped, started again, stopped. Someone in that room was not playing music. They were thinking in music, using the piano the way Poirot used silence, as a space in which to arrange uncomfortable truths. He did not enter the drawing room. He crossed the hall to the study instead, where Miriam's lamp still burned, and where the book of Don's poems still lay open, and where Vivian Crail's calling card remained beside it like an accusation waiting for someone to voice it. But Poirot did not voice it. Not yet. There was more to understand. And on this island, cut off from the world by patient grey water, there was time to understand it. If they were careful, if they were quick, if no one else decided that silence was safer than truth. Chapter 5. The Small Morning Room. Poirot established his territory with care. The small morning room at the rear of the house offered two advantages. First, comfortable chairs positioned at an angle that suggested conversation rather than confrontation. Second, a window that overlooked the gardens rather than the sea, which meant those who sat there were not constantly reminded of their isolation. An interview, Poirot had learned long ago, was an exercise in making people forget they were being questioned. He spoke to Edmund Ashworth first at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while the rain continued its patient assault on the windows, and Edmund entered with the careful casualness of a man who had prepared himself for this conversation. He wore a different suit than the morning, well tailored but showing wear at the cuffs. He settled into the chair Poirot indicated and crossed his legs with studied ease. "I assume this is about Miriam," he said. "Naturellement. You were her stepson for many years. You knew her well." "As well as anyone did, I suppose. She was not an easy woman to know. Intelligent, certainly. Reserved. She kept her own counsel." Poirot inclined his head. "Tell me about your father. About Sir Geoffrey." Edmund's expression shifted, becoming something more genuine. "My father was a force. Brilliant, demanding, impossible to please. He had very clear ideas about how the world should be ordered, and he expected the world to comply." A pause. "Oh, we were not close. He disapproved of most of my choices." "Including your choice of companions?" "Including everything. My career, my friends, my—" He stopped. "Yes, especially my companions." "You were engaged once, I believe." Edmund's face went very still. "How did you—" He collected himself. "Yes, 5 years ago. It didn't work out. The engagement ended because your father disapproved. He told me things about her background, her family, financial irregularities, he said. I believed him. I ended it." His voice dropped. "I don't know now if what he told me was true. He was capable of—" Another stop. "He was capable of arranging facts to suit his purposes." Poirot let this settle. Then, "Were you happy that summer? The summer before your father died?" Edmund looked at the window, at the rain, at anywhere but Poirot. "I was happier than I've been since." "And after his death? How did you find yourself situated?" "Waiting. The will specified that the estate would pass to me, but there were conditions, complications. Miriam had a life interest in the property. The liquid assets were tied up in trusts. I've been—" he smiled tightly, "managing." "Your finances are secure, then?" The lie, when it came, was delivered with perfect composure. A little stretched, perhaps, but nothing serious. One makes do. Poirot nodded as though accepting this. "And the codicil that was to be read, you have expectations regarding its contents?" "I assume it's more or less as expected. Personal bequests, perhaps some adjustments. Nothing that would fundamentally alter the estate provisions." But his hands, Poirot noticed, had tightened on the arms of his chair, and the fear in that gesture was not the fear of someone expecting good news. It was the fear of someone bracing for punishment. "Did Madame Ashworth ever speak to you about your father's death? About the circumstances?" Edmund's gaze sharpened. 2 months ago, she asked me about the final weeks, what I remembered, how he seemed. I told her everything. He had been agitated, working on something he wouldn't discuss. And then he died." He leaned forward. "Why was she asking? Did she think—" "What did you think, monsieur?" "I thought my father died of heart failure. That's what the certificate said." "And you believe this?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't question it. I don't know if that's the same as believing it." After Edmund left, Poirot sat alone for several minutes, and arranging his thoughts like cards in a hand he did not yet know how to play. Dr. Roland Vane arrived at 4 o'clock with his medical bag, as though he might be called away at any moment to attend to some emergency that would excuse him from this conversation. Poirot began with medicine. He asked about country practice, about the particular challenges of serving scattered communities, about the satisfaction of knowing one's patients across generations. Vane spoke with genuine warmth. This was a man who loved his profession, who had built his life around the principle of doing good. "You attended Sir Geoffrey in his final illness," Poirot said after they had established this comfortable rhythm. "I did. His heart had been troubling him for some time. He was 63, overweight, under considerable stress. It was not unexpected. But he was agitated in those final weeks." Vane's hands stilled briefly on his bag. "Yes, agitated about something personal, a matter he wanted to settle before—" He stopped. "Before," Poirot prompted gently, "before he was much older." Vane said this quickly, as though the words had a deadline. He was working on some document, some arrangement. He didn't confide the details. "And then he died." "Yes. You signed the death certificate without reservation." It was entirely consistent with his medical history. Vane delivered this statement with professional precision, looking at the space between Poirot's shoulder and the window. Cardiac failure, natural causes. Poirot let the silence extend. Then he said, "Tell me, doctor, do you believe people can change? Are truly change?" Vane looked at him directly for the first time. The question had caught him unprepared, and in the moment before he reassembled his professional mask, Poirot saw everything. The guilt, the rationalization, the careful construction of a man who had made one terrible choice and spent 5 years building walls around it. "I believe," Vane said slowly, "that a person can do one good thing and one terrible thing, and that neither necessarily cancels the other out." He was not speaking theoretically. Poirot understood this with absolute certainty. "You are a good doctor," Poirot observed. "I try to be. But 5 years ago you were asked to be something else, something less than honest." Vane's face went grey. "I don't know what you mean." "Do you not?" Poirot leaned back in his chair. "I think you know precisely what I mean, doctor. But I am not here to judge. I am here to understand, and understanding requires truth." Vane was silent for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I did what I thought was right at the time, or what I told myself was right. I don't know anymore. You were pressured. I was given information about a mistake I had made years earlier. Nothing criminal, but enough to destroy my career. I was told that if the death certificate read anything other than cardiac failure—" He stopped. "I signed. Geoffrey may well have died naturally. I couldn't know otherwise. I told myself that. I still tell myself that. But you do not believe it." Vane looked at his hands. "No, I don't believe it." After Vane departed, rapidly, as though pursued, Poirot remained in his chair, thinking about pressure and weakness and the long corrosion of living with a lie. Lawrence Gould arrived at 6 o'clock with his briefcase. He set it beside his chair with the gesture of a man who would not be parted from it even under torture. "Mr. Gould, thank you for speaking with me. I'm not certain what assistance I can provide." Gould's voice was dry as old paper. "My relationship with Mrs. Ashworth was strictly professional. You drafted the codicil." "I did." "At her instruction." "Yes." "And its contents?" are confidential. Gould's face remained expressionless. Personal bequests and a charitable endowment. Nothing that would surprise anyone familiar with Mrs. Ashworth's character. This was technically accurate, Poirot suspected, and fundamentally misleading. When did Madame Ashworth first approach you about this codicil? Gould considered this. 18 months ago. She had questions of a general nature about the probate of an estate in which there was reason to believe. He paused, selecting his words with the care of a jeweller choosing stones. Irregularities, or rather, complications. Irregularities, you said first. I revised my terminology. But the first word was more accurate, I think. Gould said nothing. Poirot shifted his approach. You are familiar with Sir Geoffrey's study, I believe, and with his habits regarding important documents. I drafted most of those documents. And the safe? The one behind the painting on the landing. Gould's hands went very still on his briefcase. Just for a moment. Then they resumed their position. But Poirot had seen the stillness, and that was enough. I am not familiar with the household security arrangements, Gould said. I think you are very familiar with them, monsieur. I think Madame Ashworth consulted you about what should be placed in that safe, and about what should be done with those contents in the event of her death. Gould's expression did not change. I cannot discuss my late client's confidential affairs. Poirot leaned forward. Tell me, who besides yourself and Madame Ashworth was aware of the full contents of the codicil? The silence that followed was absolute. Gould looked at his hands. The fingers were long, translucent, like something that had spent too long away from sunlight. He seemed to be calculating something, weighing obligations against consequences. Finally, he said, I'm bound by professional confidentiality. That is not an answer, monsieur. It is the only answer I can give. But it was an answer nonetheless. Someone else had known. Someone else had been privy to what Miriam had discovered, what she had documented, what she intended to reveal. And that someone was in this house. After Gould left, slowly as though leaving were a form of desertion, Poirot sat alone in the gathering dusk. The rain had stopped, but the windows were still streaked with water, distorting the view of the gardens into something abstract and strange. He thought about what he had learned. Edmund, desperate for money, terrified of what the codicil might reveal, still wounded by a father who had destroyed his happiness. Dr. Vane, coerced into signing a false death certificate, living with that decision for 5 years. Good and terrible in equal measure. Gould, the keeper of secrets, bound by professional ethics but constrained by something else. Fear, perhaps, or loyalty to someone other than his client. Each of them carrying something, each of them hiding something. But which of them had killed Miriam Ashworth? Or was it none of them? Was it the one person he had not yet interviewed properly? The woman with Geoffrey's eyes and Miriam's intelligence, who had heard footsteps at 1:30 and had not mentioned them to anyone but Poirot. He rose from his chair. His legs ached slightly. He had been sitting for hours. Through the window the gardens were darkening. Soon it would be time for dinner, for the careful performance of normalcy that a house party observed, even when death sat at the table. But first, one more conversation. One more piece to place before the picture became clear. He left the morning room and went in search of Vivian Crail. He found her in the drawing room, seated at the piano. She was not playing. Her hands rested on the keys without pressing them, as though she were listening to music only she could hear. Madame Creil. She looked up. In the failing light, her face was impossible to read. Monsieur Poirot, come to question me, I suppose. If you would be so kind. I am not kind, she said, but I will speak with you. She rose from the piano bench and crossed to the sofa. Poirot sat opposite her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was different from the silences of his previous interviews. It was weighted with something older, recognition perhaps, or mutual understanding of what was about to be required. Tell me about Miriam, Poirot said gently. Not as she was last week, as she was when you first knew her, when you were girls together. Vivienne's expression softened. We met at school. I was 14. She was 14. We were both clever and lonely, and we understood each other immediately. For 4 years, we were inseparable. We told each other everything. We believed we would know everything about each other forever. And then came Geoffrey. And then came Geoffrey. Her voice was steady. I loved him first, for 11 years before Miriam ever saw him. I loved him quite beyond reason. And then I introduced them because that was what friends did. And he chose her. This must have been painful. It was... She stopped. When she continued, her voice was different, or smaller. It was the end of everything I thought I understood about the world. But I told myself I was glad for them, and I mostly was. One learns to live with these things, and you remained part of the family. I could not stay away. I came every summer. I watched them build a life I should have had. I watched his son grow into a man. And this year... She looked at Poirot directly. This year I watched his daughter sit across from me at dinner, and she has his eyes. Exactly his eyes. The grief in her face was not performed. It was genuine and raw and 40 years deep. She has his eyes, Vivienne repeated. And I thought how strange it is that we spend our lives loving the wrong people. And by the time we realize it, everyone is dead or gone or has become someone we don't recognize. Poirot was very quiet. Then he asked, Were you happy that summer? The last summer before Geoffrey died? Vivienne met his gaze. I was never happy in this house after he chose her, but I came every summer because I could not stay away. This was true. All of it was true. And truth, Poirot knew, was the most dangerous weapon in the guilty person's arsenal. Thank you, madame, he said, rising. You have been most helpful. She remained on the sofa, looking at the piano, at the keys she had not pressed. Have I? She said softly. I wonder. Chapter 6. 3. Object on a mantelpiece. The outbuildings stood behind the house on a raised concrete pad, a low cluster of stone sheds that smelled of oil and sawdust, and the particular mineral damp of structures that faced the sea. Poirot found James Trevorrow in the largest of these at 4:30 in the afternoon, splitting logs with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been splitting logs since before Poirot was born. Each swing was precise. Each piece of wood fell in 2 clean halves. There was, Poirot reflected, something almost comforting about watching a man do something he had done so many times that it required no thought whatsoever. He did not announce himself. Trevorrow heard him anyway. The man's peripheral awareness, Poirot had observed, operated considerably beyond the normal range, and acknowledged his presence with a fractional tilt of the head before setting his axe and lifting the next log. A raw afternoon, Poirot ventured. October, said Trevorrow, as though this explained everything. It did, rather. The island It has been in your family's care for a long time, I understand. My father tended it before me, and his father before that. This island was a fishing settlement once, before the Ashworths bought it. Do you prefer it as it was? Trevorrow considered this with the unhurried care he appeared to bring to all questions that deserved thought. What was is gone, he said. What's here is what there is. This struck Poirot as a philosophy of considerable sophistication, though Trevorrow had expressed it without apparent effort. They were quiet for a moment. The axe rose and fell. It must hold memories for you, Poirot said. A great many memories, for a man who has spent his life watching a house and the people in it. Trevorrow set the axe down. The movement was so deliberate, so contained, that Poirot knew immediately it was significant. The man had been waiting, perhaps for days, perhaps for 5 years, for someone to say precisely this. I was here the night Sir Geoffrey died, Trevorrow said. The outbuilding was very quiet. Outside, the wind stirred the dead grass. Yes, Poirot said. The doctor came that evening, not his usual day. He crossed on the ferry at 8:30. I met him at the dock and took him up to the house. He said Mrs. Ashworth had telephoned that Sir Geoffrey was unwell. I waited. Casey was needed to go back quickly. A pause. When I brought the boat round near midnight, Dr. Vane was in the garden, with Mrs. Crail. They were speaking? Quietly, heads together, not arguing. He picked up his axe and turned the handle in his hands. An habitual gesture, something to do with his fingers while his mouth worked. Not friendly either. The kind of talking people do when they've done something together that they won't speak of again. I've seen that kind of talk. And you said nothing about this? No one asked. His voice was without reproach. He might have been commenting on the weather. Except now. Poirot nodded slowly. I am grateful, Monsieur Trevorrow. The man split a final log, set his axe against the wall with the care of someone who respected tools, and walked past Poirot into the grey afternoon without another word. Poirot stood alone in the outbuilding for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade. Dr. Vane had been on the island the night Geoffrey died. Vivian had been in the garden with him at midnight, speaking in the manner of people who have done something together that will never be mentioned again. He had suspected. Now he knew. That evening, dinner was a performance conducted under circumstances of increasing strain. Edmund drank rather more wine than was advisable and compensated by speaking rather more than was interesting. Gould ate in silence, his briefcase beside his chair like a talisman. Dr. Vane contributed nothing and consumed everything on his plate with the mechanical determination of a man who would not allow himself to be seen not eating. Vivian was composed, beautifully, terrifyingly composed. She spoke of Miriam, small things, fond things, the specific accumulation of half a century of friendship. When her voice caught slightly on one such memory, Poirot watched Cecily, who was sitting opposite, press her lips together and look at her plate. Miss Gray, the journalist, had produced a notebook earlier in the afternoon and been asked firmly by Edmund to put it away. She had put it away. She observed the table with professional attentiveness and said little. Wardlaw, the retired captain, was the most straightforwardly miserable person in the room. He had not expected death. He had come for a will reading and a few days on an island, and now he was marooned with a corpse upstairs, and people who clearly knew things they were not saying, and his discomfort was honest and unguarded and rather touching for it. After dinner, the company dispersed with unusual haste. Poirot accepted a glass of brandy and remained alone in the drawing room for 10 minutes, thinking. Then he went upstairs. In his room, Poirot moved the 3 objects that stood on his mantelpiece. There was a candlestick, a small brass clock, and a china dog of uncertain provenance, rather hideous, that had been there when he arrived, and which he had been meaning to relocate to a less prominent position ever since. He placed them in a line and adjusted their spacing until the intervals were exact, stepped back, looked at them. Then he began to pace. Theory A presented itself with compelling clarity. Vivian Crail had loved Geoffrey for 11 years before Miriam. She had watched him choose another woman and spent the subsequent decades in the particular torture of remaining close to the life she had not been given. She had been cornered by Geoffrey's forgiveness, that extraordinary, humiliating document, and she had killed him to prevent its release. She had blackmailed Vane into certifying a natural death, whom she had spent 5 years watching Miriam gather evidence, knowing that if Miriam succeeded, everything was over. When Miriam assembled everyone on this island for a reckoning, Vivian had come, because not coming would have been an admission, and had acted first. The connecting door was a gift she had not anticipated. She had used it. Everything pointed at Vivian. The calling card, Trevorrow's testimony, the connecting door, the absence of a bolt on her side. Poirot paused at the window. The night outside was very dark, the village lights invisible from this angle. He said, to no one, "Non." He resumed pacing. Theory B was less satisfying but persistent. Edmund was desperate. Edmund had known Miriam was investigating. Edmund had been conducting a correspondence with someone in this house. That quality of not looking at dinner was unmistakable. And what if that correspondence had turned towards something more purposeful than sentiment? Edmund had access to the house at all hours. The codicil clearly frightened him. If it named Cecily as Geoffrey's daughter and heir to some portion of the estate, Edmund's financial position became catastrophic. But Edmund had been surprised by Miriam's death. Poirot had watched his face at the bedroom door, and the surprise was real. Not performed. Real. Unless Edmund was a far better actor than his dinner-table conversation suggested. Poirot stopped pacing. He rearranged the china dog, moved the clock, stepped back. There was a third possibility. There was always a third possibility. He thought of Miriam Ashworth, who had arranged this gathering with the precision of a woman planning a campaign. Who had placed Vivienne in the room with the connecting door? Was that an oversight or something else? Who had put Cecily in the east wing, away from the room she had used for 3 years? Who had drafted a codicil with instructions for what should be done, with evidence in the event of her death? Who had invited Poirot not to witness a will reading, but to be present when the truth emerged? She had expected something to happen. She had prepared for it, including perhaps for the possibility that she would not be alive when it did. Poirot went very still, the letter in Cecily's pocket. He needed that letter, not merely for what Miriam had written about Vivienne, but for everything else she had written. Because if Miriam had anticipated her own death, and the more he considered her arrangements, the more this seemed not impossible but probable, then the letter would contain instructions. A woman who had spent 15 years preparing did not leave loose ends. At 11 o'clock there was a soft knock at his door. Cecily entered. She wore a dark robe over her nightclothes, and her hair was down, which made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had permitted herself to appear during daylight hours. She carried an envelope. "My room was searched," she said without preamble. "When?" "During dinner. Someone went through everything. My books were moved, my travelling case disturbed." She sat in the chair by the window as though standing were no longer an option. "There is a small locked box where I keep private papers." It was opened, not broken. The lock was picked, very neatly. The letter was not in the box. It was in the lining of my winter coat. A faint, grim satisfaction crossed her face. In a pocket that was sewn shut, I anticipated something like this. "I have been, for 3 years, living in a house where I suspected nothing was quite what it appeared." She held out the envelope. "Here. I should have given it to you immediately. I'm sorry." Poirot took the envelope. He extracted the pages carefully, unfolded them. He read standing at the window, slowly, in silence. The letter was 2 pages in Miriam's precise hand, and he had seen the beginning of it already, the sentence cut off by death. What Cecily had withheld were the pages that followed. They told him a great deal about the evidence Miriam had gathered, about where it was kept and what it contained, about what she suspected Vivian had done, and why, and the chain of complicity that led from Gould through Vane to the night of Geoffrey's death. And then, near the end of the second page, a paragraph about Cecily, about her mother's papers, about letters from Geoffrey that this woman had kept, letters that contained in their references to Vivian, to things that had been noticed, to fears that were not spoken aloud but written, as people sometimes wrote things they could not say. The papers were in storage in London. Poirot folded the letter carefully and looked at Cecily. "Your mother," he said gently. "She left papers in London." "Yes." Cecily's voice was quiet. "I hadn't opened them. I thought they were ordinary. Letters from friends, household accounts." "Did you know that your mother and Miriam had been in correspondence?" "I didn't know until I read the letter. Miriam wrote to her when she was dying 6 years ago. She wanted to know. She had been building her understanding of what happened to Geoffrey, and my mother had known him, had kept certain things. Letters he wrote." Cecily pressed her hands together in her lap. "Miriam says my mother replied, that she sent copies of letters Geoffrey had written, letters that contained, she describes them as indirect evidence, not conclusive alone, but in context. And Miriam intended to use them. She was going to tell me at the end of the weekend. She wanted me to have warning before everything came out." Cecily's voice broke slightly on the last word, then steadied. She thought of me, even then. She was arranging to give me the truth about my father and about what was done to him, and she was thinking of how I would receive it. Poirot was silent for a moment. "Did Monsieur Gould know about your mother's papers?" Cecily looked up. Something shifted in her expression, a calculation, rapid and unsettling. "He was her solicitor," she said slowly. "He handled her affairs when she died. He would have known about— Yes, he would have known what was in storage. And he told someone." It was not a question. The look on her face confirmed it without words. Poirot slipped the letter into his coat pocket and crossed to the door. He opened it a few inches and looked out into the corridor. Empty, dark, silent, except for the distant creak of the dock. "Go back to your room, Miss Martin. Lock your door. Do not open it tonight for anyone. Monsieur Poirot." The person who searched your room did not find what they were looking for. he said. "They know it exists. They will not give up." He paused. "And they are somewhere in this house at this moment, wondering what you have told me." Cecily rose. In the doorway, she stopped. "Do you know who it is?" Poirot looked at the 3 objects on his mantelpiece: the candlestick, the clock, the china dog, aligned in precise and perfect order. "I know the shape of it," he said. "The detail remains." After she left, he stood very still in the centre of his room, listening to the island, the dock, the sea, the house breathing around him, its draughts and creaks and silences. Somewhere below, a door closed. Then nothing. Poirot looked at his mantelpiece again and thought about the empty chair at dinner and the name card he had not read closely enough in the candlelight, and the particular kind of welcome that is extended to someone who does not yet know they are being welcomed. He would go to the dining room. Not tonight. Tonight was for letting the house settle, for letting the guilty believe they had been careful enough. Tomorrow, when the light was better and the shape of things clearer. Tomorrow, he would look at the name card. He suspected it would tell him something he should have understood from the beginning. He always suspected that at this stage, and he was always right. He turned off his lamp and lay in the dark, listening as the sea continued its patient work against the island's edges, wearing them down grain by grain, the way time wore everything down, until what remained was only the essential shape of things. Chapter 7. The name on the card Poirot descended to the dining room at 7 in the morning, before the house was properly awake. The room retained its evening atmosphere, curtains still drawn, the air faintly stale with the residue of candlelight and strained conversation. The table had been cleared after dinner, but not yet reset for breakfast. In the dim light filtering from the corridor, the white linen looked grey. He went directly to the far end of the table. The 9th place setting remained. It had not been disturbed during the events of the past 2 days, which told him something about the careful avoidance with which everyone in the house had treated it. The glass was still there, the arrangement of silver intact. And beside the plate, propped against the water glass in the manner of a place setting at a formal dinner, a small cream card. He had noticed it on the first evening. He had intended to read it more closely and had not, because dinner had required his attention, and because one did not scrutinize one's hostess's table arrangements without cause. He had filed it under the category of things to return to. He picked it up now. Miss C. Martin. He stood holding the card for a long moment, the house silent around him. Not Geoffrey. Not an absent friend, not a sentimental gesture toward the dead. Miriam had set a place for Cecily, for the daughter of the man she had loved and buried, for the young woman she had been quietly mothering for 3 years, without ever quite using the word, as a declaration. She had placed her at the foot of the table, opposite herself, because she intended that by the end of this gathering, the space between them would be understood by everyone present. Cecily would sit there openly, would face Miriam across the full length of the table, and everything would be acknowledged. Miriam had placed the card before Cecily knew any of this. It was a welcome, the most careful, most private kind, embedded in silverware and a seating arrangement, in the way that Miriam did everything that truly mattered. Poirot set the card down. He was still for a moment, thinking of a woman who had planned everything precisely and had miscalculated only one thing, that the person she was preparing to expose would act before she could. He thought, she did not prepare for that. And then, almost immediately, but she did, the letter to Cecily, the safe, the combination written into her instructions for him. Miriam had prepared for the possibility that she would not be present for the conclusion of her own design. She had constructed an alternative mechanism. She had, with the quiet efficiency that had apparently governed her entire life, ensured that even her death could not entirely prevent what she had set in motion. Poirot replaced the name card against the glass. Then he went upstairs to look at a painting. The landing was empty. Morning light, grey and indirect, came through the window at the end of the corridor. The maritime oil hung as he had left it, undisturbed, its gilded frame collecting shadow along the left edge where the dust pattern told its quiet story. He reached up and pressed the right side of the frame. It swung open. The safe gleamed. He had Miriam's letter in his coat pocket. He withdrew it and found the number sequence she had written in the margin of the second page, beneath a line that read, "The combination you will need is as follows, and I trust you will know when to use it." Asterisk, he dialed. 3 turns, then 2, then 1 long return. The mechanism was precise and well maintained. The door swung open without resistance. Inside, a folder, brown leather, bound with a cord tied in a double knot. Poirot lifted it out and felt its weight, substantial, dense with paper. He closed the safe, closed the painting, and carried the folder to his room. He sat at the writing desk and worked through the contents methodically, in the manner he applied to all things that deserved careful attention. There were letters from Geoffrey Ashworth to his solicitor, written in 1933, describing his discovery of certain financial irregularities concerning a trust administered by Mrs. Vivian Crail, and his instructions regarding a document of forgiveness to be drafted accordingly. There was the document itself, or rather, a copy of it, Geoffrey's own copy, which Miriam had annotated in pencil. V did not know he kept one. Characteristic G, never trusted without provision. There were letters from Cecily's mother, written in the months before her death, recounting what Geoffrey had told her privately about Vivian over the years. Not accusations, but the accumulation of an observant man's unease. References to gifts, to visits, to the way Vivian managed proximity to the things she most desired. And there was a summary in Miriam's hand, 3 pages, dated 3 weeks ago and signed at the bottom in a hand that was steady and deliberate, as though she had wanted whoever read it to know she was not afraid when she wrote it. It named everything and everyone. It constituted, in Miriam's careful assessment, sufficient reason for the proper authorities to examine the circumstances of Geoffrey Ashworth's death in 1939. Poirot read it all twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the window, where the sky had begun to lighten towards something that might eventually become morning. Enough. More than enough. He put the folder beside the letter on his desk and sat for a while with his hands folded and thought about Vivian Crail with something that was not sympathy and not its absence, but some third thing for which he did not have a word in French or English. He did 3 things that afternoon. First, he found Trevorrow in the outbuildings, as he had found him before, and asked him to write down what he had witnessed the night of Geoffrey Ashworth's death. Every detail, in his own words, witnessed and dated. Trevorrow accepted the paper and pen Poirot produced without surprise, as though this request had also been waiting to be made. "You want Cecily to witness it," Trevorrow said. It was not a question. "If you would be willing." "I'll find her," He paused. She should know. About being asked. It'll mean something to her. Poirot said, "Oui, I think it will." The statement, when Trevorrow had written it in his plain, unhurried hand, and Cecily had signed her name below his, was 7 sentences long. It contained no interpretation, no embellishment, no emotion. Simply what a man had seen on a night 5 years ago from a dock on a Cornish island. In Poirot's experience, such statements were among the most powerful documents in existence. Second, at 6:30 in the evening, he knocked at Dr. Vane's door. Vane opened it immediately, as though he had been standing on the other side, waiting. He looked at Poirot, and something in his face, some long-maintained structure, showed the first signs of giving way. Poirot said quietly, "I would be grateful if you would be in the drawing room tomorrow morning at 10. What you choose to say, or not to say, will determine a great deal. Not only for others, but for yourself." He paused. "I should tell you that the documents which were used to compel your signature on the death certificate, I have reason to believe they were fabricated. There was, in fact, professional irregularity." Vane's face went through several transformations in rapid succession. Are you certain?" "Not yet, but I will be." "If that's true—" Vane stopped. He was very still, and then very abruptly he sat down on the end of his bed, as though his legs had simply resigned from their duties. 5 years, he said. 5 years believing. "Oui," said Poirot gently. "I know." He left Vane sitting on his bed, staring at the wall, conducting some internal reckoning that was his, alone, to complete. Third, he went to the dining room and left a note beneath Cecily's name card on the table. It read, "Tomorrow at 10. All of us. I have something to return to you that was your mother's." He placed it where anyone moving through the room that night would see it. Then he went back upstairs and stood in his doorway for a moment, listening to the house. At 9:30 he heard footsteps below. Quiet, careful footsteps, the particular quality of someone who believed themselves unobserved. He heard the dining room door. A pause. The dining room door again. Then silence. He went to his room and sat at the writing desk and looked at the folder and the letter and Trevorrow's statement, arranged in precise order before him. Vivian Crail had read the note. She did not know what something that was your mother's meant. She had no reason to know that Cecily's mother had kept papers, had kept letters, had been in correspondence with Miriam. But she understood that Poirot had something, and she would come tomorrow because she had no choice. A woman who had spent 5 years managing this particular knowledge could not afford to stay away when someone announced they were about to produce evidence. She would come, and she would sit in the drawing room in the grey morning light, and she would listen, and Poirot would tell the story, not as an accusation, as a story. He permitted himself 1 long minute of sitting with the weight of it, the weight of knowing and of what knowing required of him. He thought of Miriam, who had arranged everything and had not been there for the conclusion. Of Cecily, who had come to this house as a ghost and was about to become, at last, a person with a name and a place and a history she could stand inside without apology. Of Geoffrey, who had loved unwisely in several directions and had tried, in his circumscribed way, to be good about it, while it had been killed for the attempt. He thought, understanding is not the same as forgiveness. He thought, I am not the one from whom forgiveness is required. He straightened the folder, aligned the letter beside it, set Trevorrow's statement at a precise right angle. Then he set his clock for 7 and went to bed and slept without difficulty, as he always did at the point in a case when the facts had finished assembling themselves and only the telling remained. Outside, the storm had broken during the evening without his noticing. The sea was quiet now, the dock creaking its familiar rhythmic report. Through his window, for the first time in 3 days, he could see the lights of Porthcawl across the water, small and far and clear. The world beyond the island was still there, patient and steady, awaiting to receive what the island had to offer. He would tell the story in the morning, all of it, from the beginning. 2 girls at school, and a man they both loved, and the long architecture of consequence that had led, inevitably, here. He would tell it with the care it deserved, which was considerable, not because the guilty party deserved care, but because the truth did. He thought, just before sleep, she is going to sit very still while I speak. And he thought, she has been waiting for someone to speak it for a very long time. Chapter 8. All masks removed. They gathered at 10. The storm had cleared some time before dawn, and the drawing-room windows showed a sea of polished pewter under a sky of exhausted grey. The particular stillness that follows days of turbulence, which is not peace, but it's approximate. The fires had been lit. Coffee stood on the sideboard. Nobody had touched it. They arranged themselves as people do when they have been asked to attend something whose nature they cannot quite name. The guilty with deliberate composure, the uncertain with visible unease, the innocent with the open-faced wariness of those who know only that something is about to be required of them. Edmund occupied the chair nearest the door. Gould sat exactly where he always sat, briefcase between his feet, hands folded. Dr. Vane stood by the fireplace with his hands behind his back, which was perhaps the first time in 4 days Poirot had seen him without something to hold. Wardlaw and Miss Grey positioned themselves slightly apart from the others, as observers at a scene they had not authored. Cecily sat by the window, her back very straight, and her gaze directed outward at the sea. Vivienne Crail sat in the wing-back chair by the window, the chair that had been hers since she arrived. She had dressed with her customary care. Her hands rested in her lap. Poirot stood before the fireplace. He did not clear his throat. He did not shuffle papers. He simply began to speak, and his voice in that room was the same as it always was. Precise, slightly formal, carrying the very faintest echo of French beneath its English. As though what he was about to say were the most ordinary thing in the world. "I want to tell you," he said, "about 2 girls who were friends at school. They were 14 years old and they were inseparable, and one of them loved a boy that both of them would come to love, in their different ways, across different decades." Nobody moved. These girls were not simple people. One was brilliant and reserved, the kind of person who learns very young to keep the most important things inside, because experience has taught her that what you show the world can be used against you. The other was vivid and gifted and alive in a way that filled any room she entered, and she loved with a completeness that left no part of her untouched. He paused. He did not look at anyone in particular. He was addressing the room, the house, the accumulated history of the people in it. The boy chose the first girl. He loved her, I think, more deeply than anyone in this room fully appreciated. Certainly more deeply than he expressed, being a man of his generation and temperament. He chose her, and he built his life with her, And the second girl, the vivid one, became part of the family's orbit. She came every summer because she could not stay away. She loved him still. She managed this as people manage things when they have no alternative, by being extraordinarily good company. Edmund was watching Poirot with the concentrated attention of a man beginning to understand that this story is not theoretical. Across from him, Cecily had turned from the window. Years passed. The second girl made a mistake. A financial one, neither large nor wicked, but sufficient. The man discovered it. And here is where everything turns. Poirot looked at the fire. He did not confront her. He did not threaten. He forgave her. He wrote a document of forgiveness, drafted legally, sealed until his death, intended as a final kindness, so that she would know, when he was gone, that she had been understood and not condemned. The room was very quiet. He believed this was generous. He was not wrong, but he had not understood something essential about the woman he was forgiving. That for a person whose love had never been acknowledged, whose 40 years of devotion had been received as ordinary friendship, to be forgiven as one forgives, a subordinate was not a kindness. It was the confirmation of everything she had feared, that she was, to him, a problem, a managed difficulty, not a woman worthy of the full measure of his consideration. Vivienne had not moved. Her hands remained folded in her lap. And so, Poirot said quietly, she killed him. The word fell into the room's silence and stayed there. Not at once. Over several weeks in the summer of 1939, almost she administered something slow and cardiac in its effects, disguised by his existing history, brought in small gifts and preparations with the consistency of someone who had spent years learning the rhythms of his household. She ensured that the doctor who attended him that final night was a man she had reason to believe she could manage. A good man, but a frightened one. And when Geoffrey Ashworth died, the certificate read what she needed it to read. Dr. Vane at the fireplace had closed his eyes. "There is a witness," Poirot said, "to the conversation between that doctor and Mrs. Crail on the night of Sir Geoffrey's death. He was on the island. He waited at the dock. He saw them together in the garden near midnight, speaking in the manner of people who have done something together that they will not speak of again. He has now given a written statement." Gould opened his mouth, closed it. "The doctor," Poirot continued, "was shown documents suggesting a professional irregularity in his past. He believed them genuine. He made a decision under duress. I should tell you now, Dr. Vane, that I have cause to believe those documents were fabricated by a professional forger. The irregularity did not exist." Vane's head came up sharply. He looked at Poirot with an expression of such involuntary anguish that several people in the room shifted in their seats. "You have spent 5 years under the weight of a coercion that was itself a lie," Poirot said simply. "I am sorry for it." He turned to Gould. "Monsieur Gould, the document you destroyed was Geoffrey's written forgiveness of Mrs. Crail's financial transgression. You were approached. You were pressured. You did what you felt you had no choice but to do. What you could not know, what the person who pressured you did not know, was that Geoffrey had made a copy, because Geoffrey was a careful man who understood that important documents sometimes disappeared. Mrs. Ashworth found that copy. It is in the folder I retrieved from the safe behind the painting on the landing last night." Gould's face contracted very slightly, the way a man's face contracts when he receives news that is both worse and better than he had feared. Edmund leaned forward. The safe? There's a safe on the landing? There has been, Poirot said, for some years. He turned to Edmund, and his voice, which had been level throughout, acquired a different quality, not harder, but more direct. You are not the killer, Mr. Ashworth. I want to say this clearly, because some of you have been wondering. But you are not without culpability in this matter. 2 months ago, Miss Martin came to you with questions about the estate, tentative, careful questions, because she had begun to suspect what she was and wished to understand whether she had any standing. You recognized what she was, and your response was not honesty, it was management. You wrote to her in terms that were never improper, but were consistently designed to keep her uncertain, to preserve the ambiguity that protected your inheritance. Cecily was very still. Edmund did not look at her. The correspondence you have maintained, monsieur, is not evidence of a crime, but it is evidence of character. You will need, Poirot said, without heat and without emphasis, to reckon with that. Edmund said nothing. His face had gone quite pale. The codicil, Poirot said, addressing the room now, which Mr. Gould holds and which will be read in proper circumstances once the legal formalities have been observed, acknowledges Miss Cecily Martin as the natural daughter of Sir Geoffrey Ashworth and provides for her accordingly. This was Mrs. Ashworth's intention. She reached the point in her own good time where concealment seemed to her a greater wrong than disclosure. He did not look at Cecily. He knew quite well what would happen if he did, and he needed his voice to remain steady. The room had reconfigured itself. Wardlaw looked bewildered, but steady, a man who had come for a will ridding and was receiving a considerable return on that investment. Miss Grey's notebook had appeared in her hand, and she held it without opening it, and as though unsure of her role in what she was witnessing. The journalist's instinct and the human instinct were at war, and at present the human instinct appeared to be winning. Vivienne, Poirot said. She had not moved. She had not moved for 20 minutes, and the stillness of her was the most eloquent thing in the room. She looked at him with an expression he had seen before, once at the conclusion of a case in another country entirely, on the face of someone who has been waiting for a particular day, and has found when it arrives that it is almost a relief. "You killed Geoffrey Ashworth," he said, "across several weeks in the summer of 1939. You did this because you could not endure what his forgiveness made you. Not a betrayed woman, not even a guilty one. A managed difficulty. A problem solved." He paused. "And you killed Miriam Ashworth 2 nights ago. You had known for 2 years that she was building toward a reckoning. When Lawrence Gould, indirectly without intending to, gave you reason to believe this gathering was the moment, you came to the island because not coming would have been an admission. You were placed in the room adjacent to hers. The connecting door had no bolt on your side. You entered at approximately 1 in the morning. He waited. The calling card you left in the study the afternoon before her death. You left it as a test. You wanted to see if she had already given evidence to others. When she did not react, you concluded she had not. She had simply not yet found it. She was preserving everything for the dinner, for the gathered company, for the moment when she would speak clearly and finally. She ran out of time. Another pause. You forgot to retrieve the card. That was the only thing you forgot. Vivienne said, "I loved him." Her voice was entirely steady. It was, Poirot thought, the truest thing anyone had said in this room. For 40 years, she continued, I loved him, and she had everything, and I had 40 years of summer visits and Christmas letters, and watching his son grow into a man and watching his daughter. She stopped. She has his eyes. Did you know that? She has his eyes exactly. She looked at Cecily for the first time, and something in the look was not malice, but its opposite. A recognition too painful to have been sustained until this moment. I would have given everything I am to be her mother, instead of what I became. The room was absolutely silent. He should have hated me, Vivian said. It would have been kinder. A person can survive being hated. Yes, Poirot said quietly. I know. He was not that kind of man, she said, and the smallest and most terrible of smiles crossed her face. He never was. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up at Poirot. What happens now? He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had loved with a completeness that left no part of her clean, who had done two terrible things out of pride, and spent 40 years before and 5 years after paying for them in currencies invisible to anyone but herself. Mrs. Crail, he said, I have known many people who have done terrible things. I have known those who were simply wicked, who found destruction natural and felt nothing in its aftermath. You are not among them. He paused. What you did was born from love that could not remain what it was, and from a pride I think you would surrender everything to be free of. But 2 people are dead. They were human. They deserved their years. She held his gaze. I understand, he said carefully, why you did what you did, but understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and I am not the one from whom forgiveness is required. He picked up his hat from the table. The mainland is accessible this morning. I have asked Mr. Trevorrow to bring a boat round at noon. He did not say anything further. He did not need to. Vivian sat in her chair by the window for another long moment. Then she rose, smoothly, with the particular grace of someone who had decided, at last, to stop performing, and went to fetch her coat. Chapter 9. After the storm. The boat left Trevorrow Island at noon precisely. Poirot had arranged it with the same undemonstrative efficiency he brought to all practical matters. A radio communication to the mainland the previous evening, a quiet word with the local constabulary through the intermediary of a sergeant he had once assisted in an unrelated matter at Truro, the folder of documents sealed and addressed, the appropriate people informed. By the time Trevorrow brought the boat round to the dock, everything that needed to be in place was in place. Vivian Crail came down the path between the house and the dock alone. She carried a single bag. She wore her dark blue coat, the one she had worn on the evening she arrived, and her hair was precisely arranged. And she walked with the unbowed posture of someone who had decided some time ago how she intended to conduct herself, and found no reason to revise that decision now that it finally mattered. Poirot walked beside her but did not speak. There was nothing useful to say, and he had, over a long career, learned to distinguish the silences that required filling from those that did not. At the dock, she stopped for a moment and looked back at the house on the rise. The windows were grey in the morning light. From one chimney, smoke had begun to rise. Trevorrow had lit the fires before coming down, as he did every morning. The house looked exactly as it had looked when they arrived 4 days ago. The same proportions, the same grey stone, the same quality of a face that had learned not to show what it was thinking. Vivienne looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she turned and stepped into the boat without assistance. Poirot followed. At Porthcawl, the constabulary were brief and not unkind. There were 2 of them waiting at the end of the dock with a particular expression of men who have been asked to perform an unpleasant duty and intend to do so decently. Vivienne looked at them with the same composure she had brought to everything, and when the older of the 2 addressed her, she replied with quiet courtesy and went with them without being asked a second time. Poirot watched the police car until it turned at the end of the harbour road and was no longer visible. He thought, "She has been waiting for this almost as long as she has been dreading it." He was not wrong, and he took no satisfaction from being right. The days that followed arranged themselves with a systematic orderliness of consequence. Dr. Roland Vane gave his statement to the investigating officers. All of it in full, without qualification or evasion, as a man gives a statement when he has finally put down something too heavy to carry further. The professional documents Vivienne had used to compel him were examined and found to be precisely what Poirot had suspected: fabrications, produced by a forger whose name emerged during the subsequent investigation. There had been no irregularity. There had never been any irregularity. Vane's career survived narrowly, held together by 30 years of good practice and the written testimony of patients who had trusted him to the end. He retired within the year. He sent Poirot a Christmas card in December, just his name in his doctor's hand, nothing more. He sent one every year after that. Lawrence Gould submitted to the professional review that circumstance required, and came through it diminished but intact. He retired from practice before the new year, transferred his files to a younger colleague whose judgment he trusted, and moved to the Wiltshire countryside. Poirot heard through channels that he kept bees. Whether this constituted penance or simply preference was a question that did not admit of easy answer, and Poirot did not attempt one. Edmund Ashworth received rather less from the estate than he had hoped for, and rather more than his conduct had earned him. He did not contest the codicil. This surprised several people who knew him, though it did not surprise Poirot, who had observed that beneath the performed charm and the financial desperation, a residual capacity for recognizing what was owed. Edmund wrote to Cecily a letter, one letter that was not precisely an apology but existed in the same general neighbourhood. She did not reply for 6 months. When she did, the reply was brief and without warmth but also without cruelty, which was perhaps the best either of them could manage in the circumstances. The will reading, finally conducted in the drawing-room of Trevorrow House by a colleague of Gould's several weeks later, confirmed what Miriam had arranged, that Cecily Martin, natural daughter of Sir Geoffrey Ashworth, was acknowledged and provided for in terms that could not be described as anything less than generous. Miriam had, it emerged, been thoroughly generous in nearly every direction. Even Edmund's provision, though reduced by the codicil's terms, was sufficient to address his most pressing difficulties, if he exercised the kind of restraint he had previously found uncongenial. Captain Wardlaw returned to wherever he had come from, wrote Poirot a brief note expressing his admiration for the clarity with which the business had been conducted, and was not heard from again. Miss Diana Gray published her account 3 months later in a London periodical. Not the salacious account of a murder on an island that a less scrupulous journalist might have produced, but a measured examination of the law of inheritance, the question of illegitimacy, and the long-delayed reckoning with what was owed to those who had been quietly excluded from their own histories. She did not name names. She did not need to, and those who knew the story recognized it, and those who did not were perhaps the better for its general application. Cecily Martin remained at Trevorrow House through the winter. In late November, she went to London and opened her mother's papers, which had been waiting for her in a solicitor's storage room for 6 years. She sat with them for 2 days in a rented room near Bloomsbury and read what they contained. Household correspondence, letters from friends, the ordinary accumulation of a life lived quietly. And then, at the bottom of the 3rd box, a packet tied with cotton ribbon, addressed in an unfamiliar hand. The letters inside were Geoffrey Ashworth's. There were 31 of them, written over 15 years. They were not the letters of a guilty man managing a consequence. They were the letters of someone who had loved carefully across distance and limitation, who had been sorry in the ways available to him, who had asked after her education and her happiness and the small particulars of her days with an attentiveness that was not obligation, but something warmer. They were imperfect letters, constrained by the arrangements that circumstance and cowardice had made necessary. But they were his, and they were hers. In the last box, she found a photograph she had not known existed. Her mother and Geoffrey standing in a garden somewhere in summer. Not Trevorrow, somewhere softer, somewhere the light fell differently. They were both laughing. Unself-consciously, completely, in the manner of people who are happy without being aware they are being observed. Cecily looked at this photograph for a long time, and then she brought it back to Cornwall with her and placed it on the mantelpiece in the drawing room, in the position where the other photograph had stood on her very first day. The one that had been moved to the study, in the space where it had always belonged. She was, she found, in the right room. James Trevorrow brought wood that afternoon without being asked, as he always had. He set it by the fire and straightened and looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece for a moment and said nothing, which was his natural mode of expressing approval. Over the weeks that followed, this became the shape of things. Cecily at the desk or the window or the morning room with her books, Trevorrow outside doing the work of the island with his unhurried precision, but the house settling gradually back into something that resembled occupancy rather than performance. Poirot left Trevorrow Island on the same hired boat that had brought him, 10 days after the morning of the revelation. He carried his valise and the folder of documents which he would pass to the appropriate authorities in London. Nothing else. At the dock, he paused. He had not planned to. He had intended to step directly into the boat, to leave as he had arrived, with efficiency and without sentiment. But his legs did not cooperate, and he found himself standing at the top of the dock path, looking back. The house stood on its rise above him, exactly as it had stood for 150 years of Cornish weather. Its windows were grey in the morning light, smoke from a single chimney. The gardens below the front terrace were salt-roughened, the scrub vegetation leaning as it had always leaned. The path up from the dock, worn to pale granite by generations of feet. He thought of the 9th place setting, the cream name card propped against a wine glass in the candlelight, which he had not read closely enough on the first evening. He thought of a woman who had arranged everything every room, every guest, every detail, with the patience of someone who'd been waiting 15 years for the right moment, and who had been betrayed finally not by lack of preparation, but by a connecting door she had not thought to lock, because she had not known it was there. He thought she knew. Even in those last hours reading in the lamplight, she had known. She had underlined 2 words in a poem about death's arrogance and placed them there on her desk for whoever came after. And she had put the name of someone she loved at the empty place at the table. And she had written a letter she did not quite finish, and she had been, in the only way available to her under the circumstances, unafraid. He got into the boat. Trevorrow started the engine without ceremony. The island receded. The house grew smaller, its grey stone merging eventually with the grey of the cliff face, the grey of the October sky. From this distance it was indistinguishable from the landscape that surrounded it, which was perhaps as it should be. On the crossing, Poirot sat in the bow with his coat buttoned against the salt wind and watched Porthcawl grow slowly larger across the water. He was carrying something that was not in the folder beside him, some weight that had no official classification, that would not be required by the appropriate authorities or entered into any file. The weight of a story that had not been, finally, about crime at all. It had been about love, and what love does to people when it cannot be what it is. About the long, patient distances maintained between people who share houses and histories and never quite reach each other. About a pride so fundamental it became a weapon. About a kindness so poorly aimed it became a wound. About 40 years of summer visits conducted in the shadow of an absence. He arrived at the mainland. He took the train to London. 2 weeks later, Poirot's breakfast table was set as it had always been set. The cup at precisely the correct angle, the toast in its rack, the egg in its cup, the small jug of hot milk in its exact relation to the coffee pot. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. He sat down, he reached for his cup, and then he stopped. The chair across from him was empty, as it always was. He dined alone. This was not unusual. He had always preferred the clarity of solitary breakfast to the obligation of conversation before his faculties were fully engaged. The empty chair was simply the empty chair, an absence of no particular significance. But for a moment, 5 seconds perhaps no more, he saw it differently. Not as the habitual vacancy across a set table, as the space where someone was expected and had not arrived, as a place laid with care for a person who would come too late, or not at all, or a name card waiting in the candlelight for someone it was written for. He thought of Miriam Ashworth, who had set a welcome for a daughter who did not yet know she was being welcomed. He thought of the 9th place, and of what it meant to hold a space open for someone. He was still for 5 seconds. Then he poured his coffee and straightened his spoon to its correct position beside his cup, and picked up the morning paper and began. Outside his windows, London conducted its habitual business in the grey October light. Taxis, pedestrians, the ordinary, unremarkable machinery of a city proceeding with its day. Everything continuing as it had before. Everything as it should be. Everything, and the particular weight of knowing, which did not leave, which would not leave, that some cases were not solved so much as survived. He turned the page of his newspaper. He began,